This shy human avoided every orc, but one orc girl secretly followed him home. She's trapped. "Cannot move!" The voice cracked on the wet stone, low and ragged, half swallowed by rain. Blood soaked through torn fur wrappings at her side, and her breath came in short, fighting pulls. Tomas nearly walked past her, his axe slung over one shoulder, his boots worn thin from years on the mountain path. Then he saw the size of her, curled against the rock like something broken that should not exist, and fear lost to instinct. He knelt anyway, pressed his cloak to the wound. Beneath torn leather, a signet burned into her forearm caught. The grey light, a shape unlike any clan mark he'd ever seen. He had no idea what he'd just carried through his own front. Draw if forbidden bonds between two worlds. Pull at your heart the way this one's about to. Stay to the very end. What happens next changes everything. And hit subscribe to Orkbon Saga now, before you forget, because you will not want to miss where this goes. 3 days of rain, and Thomas Aldrich had long since learned the mountain didn't care whether a man wanted to be out in it. He'd gone up before dawn to check his snares, hoping for a hare to stretch through the week, and had nearly turned back twice before the wind shoved him past the ravine where the world nearly ended for both of them. Hollow Pine sat at the foot of the eastern range, built on one unspoken rule: keep your back to the mountains, bolt your door after dark. Old men still told fireside stories of orc war parties, 2 generations gone, of valleys left in ash. The fear had softened into superstition, but never quite burned away. Children were raised believing what lived in the high passes was not meant to be met. Tomas had believed it too, until the moment he looked down and saw something too large to be human, bleeding into the mud. Getting her through his door took the better part of an hour and nearly broke his back twice. 1.5 feet taller than him, even folded in pain, she was built with the dense, coiled strength of something made for war, and wounded. She still nearly crushed his shoulder under her arm's weight. He laid her on his own bed, because the floor felt like an insult to someone bleeding that badly, and worked through the night by firelight, boiling water, tearing his last clean shirt into strips, pressing crushed yarrow and comfrey into the gash along her ribs. She watched him the entire time, not with gratitude, with the flat assessing stare of something deciding whether the trap had already sprung and simply hadn't been felt yet. A short, curved blade lay beside her, hilt wrapped in wire that caught the firelight like real gold. When his hand brushed her wrist to check her pulse, she flinched hard, and for half a heartbeat, something crossed her face that didn't belong to a warrior's pain. It belonged to a much older wound. "Why?" she said finally, when he offered his own blanket, voice clipped and formal, like a language carried carefully across a long distance. "You are smaller. Weaker. I could break you without trying." He shrugged, tucking the blanket at her shoulder the way he might have for a child. "A person in pain doesn't need to be strong to deserve help." She didn't answer. She didn't sleep either. He heard her breath held deliberately controlled against the fire's crackle, one eye always half open even in exhaustion. Once near the deepest hour, he thought he heard her murmur a name that wasn't his, broken and low. Before she caught herself and went silent, he didn't ask. He didn't know that somewhere beyond the ridge, riders were already moving through the dark. He didn't know the woman bleeding in his bed had a name spoken with reverence and fear across half the eastern mountains. He only knew that the low, careful way she watched him made him want, for the first time in 6 years, to be watched back. He hadn't always lived alone. He'd had a sister, Ilsa, 4 years younger, sharp-tongued, quick to laugh. The spring he turned 25, the river flooded, swollen with snowmelt and running faster than Hollow Pine had ever seen. A neighbor's child wandered too close to the bank. Ilsa went in after her. Thomas froze on the shore a moment too long before his legs obeyed. By the time he threw himself in, the current had already dragged her under the old bridge's fallen timbers, the ones the village council had meant to clear for 2 seasons and never had. He pulled her out. Her lips were already blue. No amount of pressing brought her back. He carried her body up the bank himself, refusing every hand offered, as though the weight of her were a penance he had no right to set down. He never spoke of it again. He didn't need to. The whole village remembered, and remembered too that he'd hesitated a breath longer than a braver man might have. "Coward," some muttered, when they thought he couldn't hear. He always could. He built the cottage at the edge of the trees with his own hands and made himself one silent vow, carved deeper than any scar. If he ever again had the chance to save someone, he would not hesitate. Whatever it cost him, the orc's name, though he didn't know it yet, was Vashka Emberhold, since she hadn't chosen to be alone in that ravine any more than he'd chosen to be alone in his cottage, third-generation chieftain of a matriarchal clan that had clawed its way to power through 3 brutal wars. She'd been trained since she could stand to give no ground, show no weakness, trust no one, because in her world, trust was a coin spent only by fools and the dead. 3 nights before Tomas found her, the great hall had been strung with banners for a treaty supper. Northern clans and eastern clans at the same table for the first time in a generation, and Vashka at the head of it, exhausted from months of careful negotiation, finally bearing fruit. Kesh had stood at her shoulder the whole evening, as he always did, refilling her cup himself with his own hand, the way he'd done since she was a girl too small to reach the pitcher. She'd noticed the warning signs for weeks before that night, ledgers that didn't add up, a guard rotation changed without her order, small inconsistencies she'd caught and then talked herself out of, because the alternative meant believing the man who'd raised her half her life could turn against her. She hadn't wanted that to be true, so she hadn't looked closely enough. The cup was nearly at her lips, the hall raising a toast to the new treaty, when a servant girl, one who'd served Vashka's mother before her, who owed Kesh nothing and Vashka everything, leaned close as if to clear a plate and whispered a single word against her ear. "Don't." Vashka set the cup down as if she'd simply lost interest in it, laughed off a comment from the northern delegation, and excused herself minutes later to check on the kitchens. She didn't stop walking until she was 3 corridors away, and didn't stop running until she was past the outer gate. That hesitation, that small refusal to see what stood plainly in front of her for weeks beforehand, had very nearly cost her everything. Only that servant's warning, delivered in the space of a single word, had saved her at all. She fled the hall not knowing which of her own guards still answered to Kesh's coin. Ran 3 days through unfamiliar terrain, sleeping in snatches, watching every shadow. On the 3rd night, exhausted past senses, the scree gave way beneath her and tore her side open on stone. She had led armies, negotiated peace between clans that had hated each other for 100 years. She had never once been tended by someone who wanted nothing from her in return. So when a rough-handed human knelt beside her in the mud and asked for nothing, not her name, not her worth, not what she might owe him, something in her that had been braced for years, without her ever realizing it, loosened by a fraction she couldn't name. She still didn't trust him, but some old, walled-off part of her had started, quietly, to wonder. The first days were 2 wary animals circling, each waiting to see who struck first. Thomas learned to warn her before he moved, the way he'd once gentled a spooked horse in his father's stable. She began answering his careful questions with fewer half-truths, though never enough to guess who she truly was. On the 3rd evening, over thin barley stew, she admitted, almost embarrassed by it, that she couldn't remember a meal that hadn't been prepared either to impress someone or tested first for poison. He only refilled her bowl without being asked. He gave her his bed and slept on the floor by the hearth. This confused her more than anything else in the house. "In my world," she said, watching him sharpen his axe, "comfort flows towards strength, never away from it. Why give up your bed to something that could snap you in 2? Bed doesn't do a man much good," he said, "if someone else needs it worse." She lay awake a long time, turning that sentence over like a stone she couldn't quite identify. By the 2nd week, weariness had given way to something closer to curiosity and something closer to warmth. She taught him her word for honor, for the loyalty that bound warriors to chieftain past death. He taught her hearth, neighbor, the small, unglamorous kindness that carried a village through a hard winter. She butchered his language. He butchered hers worse, badly enough once, that her word for courage came out sounding like her word for a common root vegetable. She laughed. A short, startled sound, like a muscle gone stiff from disuse. Something in the small room shifted when she made it. There were misunderstandings, too. She spoke of old scars with blunt, unself-conscious pride, listing wounds like honors. He stammered and looked away. He thanked her so many times for small courtesies, holding a door, passing salt, that she wondered if he thought her simple. Before understanding, it was simply how his people showed respect. Neither of them was wrong. Both were slowly learning the shape of the other's heart. Then the small wrongness started, gathering herbs at the tree line. Thomas thought he saw a shape move between the pines, gone before he could be sure it had ever been there. Vaska went tense for the rest of that evening, then brushed it off, mountains playing tricks on tired eyes. He let it go. He didn't know she'd started quietly, counting the days since her flight. A few nights later, the storm returned in full. Thunder cracked, and Vaska sat bolt upright, hand flying to a blade that wasn't there, before catching herself with an embarrassed breath. "Armed men I understand," she admitted when he asked. "Thunder I cannot fight. Cannot outthink, cannot outmaneuver." There was something in that helplessness she'd never learned to sit with. He had no clever answer. He only banked the fire higher and sat closer, and somewhere between one roll of thunder and the next. Her hand found his in the dark and didn't let go until morning. The next morning he found boot prints near the stream. Too fine, too deliberate for any hunter from Hollow Pine, pressed into mud, still wet at dawn. He said nothing yet, but he started sleeping with his axe closer, and twice more caught Vaska staring too long at the ridgeline, jaw set, saying nothing either. "Are we being watched?" He finally asked her outright. She was quiet for a long moment. "I can't be certain. In my old life, certainty had a way of arriving too late to matter. After that, she started teaching him things beyond words. The weight of a blade, how to read tension in a stranger's shoulders, how to listen to a forest, for the particular silence that meant something else was listening too. He was a poor student of combat, but he learned the listening fast, and more than once his ear, tuned by a lifetime alone in these woods, caught the wrong kind of quiet, a breath before she did. There was one morning, near the end of the second week, when he risked taking her to the market at the edge of Hollow Pine. Hood up, cloak wrapped high, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over the tips of her ears. Reckless, maybe, but she'd been indoors 9 days, and the walls of his cottage had started to feel less like shelter and more like a cage. And he found he couldn't stand watching her pace it any longer. It went wrong within minutes. An old woman selling onions looked too long at the height of her, at the wrong angle of her shoulders under the cloak, and Vaska's whole body went rigid, the way it had that first night, hand drifting toward a blade she'd left behind. Thomas stepped between them without thinking, made some clumsy joke about his tall cousin visiting from the north, and steered her away before the old woman's suspicion could sharpen into anything worse. They didn't speak until they were well past the tree line, back toward the cottage, both of them breathing harder than the walk should have earned. "That was foolish," Vaska said finally. "I know. You could have been hurt. Worse than hurt, if word had spread before we were clear. I know that too," he kept walking. "Wanted you to see something that wasn't inside of my house is all. Wasn't thinking past that." She was quiet long enough that he thought he'd angered her. Then, "No one has ever risked something foolish simply so I could see an onion stall." He glanced sideways at her, and there, for just a moment, was that same startled laugh, quieter this time, half swallowed by the wind. She didn't explain it. He didn't ask her to. 3 riders, fast along the ridge trail, no one in Hollow Pine used unless desperate. Vaska went utterly still, hand on her hilt before her mind caught up with her instincts. Through the narrow window she watched them come, and the colour drained from her face in a way Thomas had never once seen in 9 days. For one terrible moment he believed the worst, that these riders had come for him, that whatever trouble followed her had finally found his door. But she didn't move to run. She straightened her spine. "There may not be another chance to tell you this honestly," she said. "So I will tell you now." She told him everything, chieftain, eastern clans. a trusted advisor who'd tried to have her killed. Tomas stood very still, watching 9 days rebuild themselves in his head. The fine stitching he'd dismissed as firelight, the signet she'd always kept turned away, the way she gave orders, even sickness. As if command were simply the shape her voice took. "Why didn't you tell me from the start? I didn't know if I could trust you. Whether you'd sell word of me the moment you learned what I was worth." A pause. "And then I was afraid of exactly this. That you'd start weighing me the way everyone else does, once they learn the title. Was that all I was to you? A hiding place? A roof against the rain? No." Her voice cracked on the word, but he'd already turned toward his coat, grief from Ilsa layering itself over this fresh wound. The 9 days, threatening to close over like water, settling above a dropped stone. Then the shouting started outside. Not her guards' voices, harsher ones, and beneath them the ring of drawn steel. Vashka was at the window in one motion. "Hired swords," she said, low and cold. "No clan colors. Kesh's coin spends the same as anyone's." There was no room left for wounded pride. Thomas had his axe off the wall before he'd finished the thought. Vashka snatched her blade, wound still tender enough to steal her breath, and told him sharply to stay behind her. He didn't. The first man came through the yard gate swinging wide, and Tomas dropped him with the wolf snare branch he'd rigged years ago and never bothered to take down, the man's own weight doing the work, the trap snapping taut and folding him backward into the mud. A second came in low, fast, and Vashka met him blade to blade, driving him back 3 steps with a fury that had been 9 days building. "Behind you!" Thomas shouted. She pivoted, too slow, the wound at her side flaring white-hot pain through her, and the third man's blade came for Tomas's unprotected back instead. She threw herself into it, took the cut across her forearm that should have opened Tomas's spine, and drove her own blade up under the attacker's guard in the same motion, ending it. For a moment, neither of them moved. Rain hammered the yard. 2 men down, 1 fled, and then hoofbeats, her true guard, cresting the ridge at a dead run, except it wasn't over. The lead rider, a guardsman Vashka had trusted since he was a boy training in her mother's yard, one of the 3 she'd sent ahead to scout this very trail, didn't raise his blade against the fleeing hired sword at all. He rode straight past him, straight at Vashka's unguarded side, blade already coming down. Rurik got there first. He came off his own horse mid-stride and took the guardsman down in the mud before the strike could land. The 2 of them grappling in the rain until Rurik's blade found the gap in his armor and ended it for good. It happened so fast that Thomas, still catching his breath from the fight in the yard, barely understood what he'd seen until it was already over. A man Vashka had known for years, dead in the mud by his own captain's hand, for trying to kill her the moment her real guard arrived to save her. Vashka stared down at him for a long moment, rain running off her face, saying nothing. Whatever she felt, she folded it away someplace Thomas couldn't reach yet. 3 years he rode at my side, she said finally, quiet enough that only Thomas heard it. 3 years, and I never once saw it. Silence, ringing and strange, when the rest of it was finally over. Blood on both their hands. Neither of them are steady on their feet. "I don't care what title your people give you," Thomas said. "I care about the woman who laughed at my terrible pronunciation, who gave me half her stew when there wasn't enough for 2. In 9 days, Vashka said, voice steady now, you've seen me more clearly than anyone at court ever has. I don't know how to simply walk away from that, but under the relief, a colder thought was already moving in her. The hired men knew exactly where to find her. Someone close, someone who shouldn't have known, had sent word ahead of her own guard. The traitor's reach ran deeper than she'd feared, and the question of who among her own people still answered to Kesh's coin remained dangerously, urgently open. Rurik confirmed it within the hour, grim-faced, going through what little the dead guardsman had carried. A folded scrap of paper, tucked inside his boot, marked the cottage's location with an accuracy that made Thomas's stomach drop before Rurik even finished reading it aloud, because the description on it wasn't drawn from any spy's careful surveillance. It named the cottage as the woodcutter's place near the onion stall, edge of hollow pine, tall cousin seen there. Thomas went very still. His own clumsy lie, the one he'd offered a suspicious old woman in a village square to protect Vashka, had travelled. Market gossip passed hand to hand, village to trader, trader to somebody already listening for exactly this kind of story, until it landed in the hands of the one man positioned to use it. He'd meant to keep her safe that day. Instead, he'd handed the conspiracy the one detail it had been missing. "This isn't your fault," Vashka said, watching his face change. "It found you because of something I did." He couldn't make the words land any softer than that, no matter how he tried. A joke to an onion seller, that's all it took. She didn't argue with him again. She only took his hand once, and let the silence say what she couldn't yet put into words, that in her world, a single careless sentence getting someone killed was simply the cost of trusting anyone at all. And she had long since stopped believing it disqualified them from being trusted further. That night, guard camped a respectful distance off. She told Thomas what she hadn't told even her most trusted captain. A shape in the shadow of the hall's east door, the night of the poisoning, that she'd told herself was only torchlight playing tricks. She no longer believed that. "Someone watched me drink," she said. "Someone watched me flee. And that same someone still moves freely inside my own hold." Thomas listened without interrupting, the way she needed him to. When she finished, he asked only one question. Who among her people had known she favored this particular stretch of the Eastern Trail before the storm? She went very still. The answer was a short list. Every name on it belonged to someone she'd once called family. 3 days later, healed enough to stand tall, she came to him dressed as what she truly was. Fine mail beneath a deep green cloak, the signet worn openly at her collar now, her guard waiting at the tree line with their eyes carefully elsewhere. She didn't waste words during the ceremony. "I want you to come with me, not as a servant, not as a curiosity for my court to whisper about, as my equal, the man I intend to stand beside for the whole of my rule, if you'll have me." She told him her clan would resist it fiercely, that she no longer cared what any of them called it, "but if none of it matters to you," she said, and her voice softened in a way he'd only heard once before, by the fire. "If the mountains and the crown mean nothing beside the life you've built with your own hands, I would understand. I would rather lose you to your own simple life than trap you in a cage, gilded with my crown, and call it love." Thomas walked to the edge of the trees and back, the weight of it turning over in him. Everything he knew stood right here. The cottage, his sister's grave on the hill, a small, careful life built from guilt and solitude. Everything Vashka offered was terror wearing the shape of a gift, a world where he'd always be the smallest thing in any room, where her people might never forgive her choice, where he might fail her exactly when it mattered, the way he'd failed once on a riverbank. But he thought of 9 days, of a woman who'd never once, in a life ruled by war and cold calculation, been simply seen, and how he'd been the one to see her first. He thought of Ilsa and the vow carved into him deeper than any scar. "I don't want your mountains or your crown," he said. "I want you, only you. I'm terrified, and I'm coming anyway, because going back to the quiet life I spent 6 years mistaking for peace doesn't feel like safety anymore." She crossed the yard and took his face in both hands and kissed him there in the pale morning light, in front of her guard and the waiting mountain and the whole uncertain future ahead of them. It wasn't grand. It was quiet and real, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember. Entirely enough, the Eastern court did not welcome him easily. Elders muttered that their young chieftain had been bewitched by something small and unworthy of clan honor. Dreg made it formal, broad as a doorframe, a scar through one eyebrow from a campaign fought before Thomas was born. He stood before the assembled clan and struck the haft of his spear against the stone floor 3 times, the old challenge, the one no chieftain's consort had ever refused in living memory. "She was to be mine," Dreg said, not to Thomas, but to the hall, to the elders watching from the high benches. 10 years I courted her in the old ways. 10 years of patience, of proving myself worthy by every custom this clan holds sacred. And she gives her hand instead to a woodcutter who's never held a blade in earnest, who couldn't outlast me a single minute in this circle. He turned to Thomas at last. Take up a weapon. Or step aside and spare us both the shame of pretending otherwise." The hall went silent. Vashka's hand tightened at her side, but she didn't speak. This was Thomas's challenge to answer, and both of them knew it. Thomas didn't reach for a blade. "You're right," he said, loud enough to carry. "I'd last less than a minute against you, and everyone in this hall knows it, including me." A murmur ran through the elders, not what they'd expected. But strength in a circle isn't the only thing worth wagering a life on. Give me the winter. If the passes hold, if fewer of your people die in the deep snow than died last year or the year before, then I've earned my place by a different measure than yours, and if I'm wrong, I'll withdraw my claim myself in front of this same hall, and you can have your circle after all." Dreg studied him for a long moment, spear still in hand. Then, slower than anyone expected, he lowered it. "A wager I can respect," he said. "Winter, then, and I'll be watching every day of it. It saved more lives than even Thomas had dared hope." When the deep snow came, his knowledge of drift patterns and shelter routes kept 3 separate hunting parties from being caught out past the storm line. Parties that, by the hold's own grim record, had lost people to exactly that in each of the 5 winters before. Grudging respect followed where a blade never could have earned it, and Dreg, to his credit, was among the first to offer it, clasping Thomas's forearm in the old warrior's grip without a trace of mockery in it. But the deeper wound in the court hadn't closed. Kesh had vanished into the mountains. Someone inside the hold, someone with access to maps and travel routes known only to a trusted few, had passed word to hired blades with terrible precision, and that someone hadn't been found. Vashka moved through her own court now, watching faces she'd known her whole life. Unable to fully trust any of them, he surfaced once more, briefly, and only for her. A shepherd boy carried the note to her hand, unable to say who'd given it. Only that a tall man, with silver at his temples, had pressed a coin into his palm and asked him to deliver it to the chieftain and no one else. It named a place on the ridge above the hold, a night and nothing more. She went alone against Rurik's furious objection, taking only a blade and a promise to return before dawn. Thomas wanted to come. She told him no. This was a conversation 20 years old, and it belonged to her to finish, not him to carry. Kesh was waiting exactly where the note said, "Hood down," older than she remembered, though barely a year had passed. He didn't rise when she drew her blade. "If I meant to kill you tonight," he said, "I wouldn't have written first. You already tried twice. Poison, then hired men. I know what I've done." Something in his voice had gone hollow in a way she'd never once heard in 20 years. "I'm not here to ask forgiveness. I don't believe I've earned the right to ask you for anything. Then why call me here at all?" He was quiet for a long time, staring into the dark below the ridge. "Your mother didn't build this clan on treaties and patience the way you have," he said finally. "She built part of it on a night at Karim's Hollow that no history in this hold has ever recorded honestly. And I was the one who carried her order, and the one who carried it out. 60 souls, an allied clan's war camp, non-combatants among them, because she judged their loyalty uncertain on the eve of a war she couldn't afford to lose. I've carried that night for 20 years, Vashka. I taught you to hold a blade with the same hands that did that." He looked up at her at last. "This past year, the northern clans started asking old questions again, the kind that don't fade, the kind that end in blood feuds lasting generations. I told myself I was protecting this clan from a reckoning it couldn't survive. I told myself removing you quietly before you found that truth and did something honorable and disastrous with it was mercy." Vashka's hand didn't lower, but it had gone very still. "You don't know what I would have done with it." "No," Kesh admitted. "I decided I already did. That failure was mine long before it was ever yours." He rose slowly, and for a moment looked less like the man who'd nearly killed her twice, and more like the exhausted advisor who'd once taught a girl too small to lift a blade how to hold one anyway. "I won't ask you to spare me. I only wanted you to know it was never gold in the end. It was never that simple." He stepped back into the tree line. "Do with that whatever you can live with, chieftain." I couldn't. He was gone before she could decide whether to stop him. She told Thomas everything when she returned, hours before dawn. her hands still faintly unsteady, with a grief she hadn't expected to feel for a man who'd tried twice to end her life. He didn't tell her what to do with it. He only sat with her until the shaking stopped, the way she had once sat with him through a storm that frightened her more than any blade ever had. She never told the wider court what Kesh confessed that night. Some truths, she decided, deserved a single decision made by the person willing to carry the weight of it alone. And she had already watched exactly where it led to a man who made that same choice for her. 20 years too late to matter. It was Yura, the Hold's oldest healer, who found the rest of it, and she found it by accident. Looking for nothing at all, she'd come to trade cuttings with Thomas one grey afternoon, the two of them comparing which herbs grew wild in the lowlands against which grew only this high. And her eyes caught on the small leather satchel he kept his dried yarrow in, worn soft with age, stitched along the seam in a particular looping knot he'd never thought twice about. Because his mother had taught him to tie it before he was old enough to remember learning, Yura went very still. "Where did you learn that stitch?" "My mother. She sewed everything in our house that way. Curtains, blankets, this satchel." Never explained why. She wasn't from Hollow Pine originally, she used to say, though she never said where she was from. What was her name? "Mirella." He frowned at the strange weight suddenly in the old woman's face. "Why?" Yura sat down slowly, as if her legs had stopped agreeing to hold her up on their own. "I carried a girl of that name out of a burning camp 40 years ago, she said. "Kareem's Hollow. I was a servant girl myself then, ordered by Kesh in secret to take what children could still walk and get them past the border before anyone counted the bodies closely enough to notice how many were missing. I taught her to stitch myself on the road, to keep her hands busy so she wouldn't have to think about what she'd seen." Her voice shook. "I never learned what became of any of them after the border. I told myself not knowing was easier." Thomas didn't move. Something very old and very quiet was rearranging itself behind his ribs into a shape he didn't yet have words for. "My mother flinched at loud noises," he said finally. "Fire, mostly. She never told me why." He told Vashka that night, and she said nothing for a long while, sitting with the weight of it the way she'd sat with Kesh's confession on the ridge only days before. Her mother had ordered 60 deaths to secure a war. Kesh had carried out that order, and then, in the same breath of guilt, had spent that same night smuggling out whoever he could carry, at the risk of his own life, if anyone had ever found out. And 40 years later, one of those saved children's sons had knelt in a ravine in the rain and pulled her out without asking her name. "He never told me there were survivors," she said quietly. "On that ridge, in all his talk of guilt and mercy, he let me believe the massacre was only ever a wound he carried. Not one he'd also tried, however badly, to close." "Maybe he couldn't say it," Thomas said. "Not without admitting the two don't cancel out. That saving a handful doesn't undo what happened to the rest." He looked down at his own calloused hands, the same ones that had held his sister too late on a riverbank. "I understand that better than I'd like to." Neither said what both were thinking, that if this ever reached the wider court, if the eastern clans learned their chieftain's own mother's atrocity now sat quite literally in her bed in the shape of a descendant, the reckoning Kesh had killed to prevent might arrive anyway, carried by the last person either of them would ever have expected to bring it. Word reached Hollow Pine too. Traitor, bewitched, sold to the enemy. A border lord used the scandal as leverage against Vashka's clan for trade concessions. Advisors pressed her to distance herself from Tomas for the treaty's sake. "I already lost one advisor to betrayal wearing the mask of duty," she told them every time. "I will not lose myself the same way twice." One winter evening, Tomas sat staring into the hearth fire of the chamber they now shared, and Vashka found him withdrawn. "What troubles you?" "I watch you hold court," he said finally. "Command warriors twice your size with one look. Negotiate peace between clans that warred before your mother's time. And some nights I wonder what a woman capable of all that could possibly need from a woodcutter with rough hands and no name worth speaking." "I didn't choose you despite your ordinary life," Vashka said. "I chose you because of it. You're the only soul who's ever wanted nothing from my crown. That's worth more to me than every warrior who ever knelt before my mother's throne." He watched her hold court the next morning, from the edge of the hall where he'd learned to stand, close enough to matter, far enough not to be seen as a distraction. Two lesser clans had come with a dispute over grazing rights along a shared border stream, both sides certain the other had moved the boundary stones in the night. Voices rose. A hand went to a hilt. Vashka let the argument run its course before she spoke a single word, watching faces, not the dispute itself. When she finally stood, the hall went quiet on its own. "The stones did not move themselves," she said, "and I don't much care which of you moved them first, because both of you have spent a season blaming the other instead of fixing it. You'll rebuild the boundary together this week, under my steward's watch. Whoever refuses to lift a stone forfeits grazing rights on that stream for a full year." She looked between them. "That is not punishment. That is the last patience either of you will get from me on this." Both clans left grumbling, and neither drew a blade. Tomas found her afterward rubbing at her temple, the weight of an entire morning settling into her shoulders all at once. "You make it look easy," he said. "It is never easy." She let out a breath. "It is only quick, if you do it right. My mother taught me that. The moment you let a grievance sit unresolved past sundown, it roots. By spring it's a blood feud instead of a fence line." She glanced at him. "You listen to all of that, every word. Most in this hold stop listening the moment the shouting starts. You never do." She said it like an observation, not a compliment, though he understood by now those were often the same thing, coming from her. Not everyone in the hold needed a full winter to come around. Rurik, captain of Vashka's personal guard, a broad-shouldered veteran who'd served her mother before her, had watched Thomas from the first day with an expression Thomas couldn't quite read. Not hostile. Exactly, but not warm either. It was Rurik who found him alone at the practice yard one grey morning, well before the rest of the hold had woken, swinging a borrowed sword through forms far too advanced for him, and failing every one of them. "You're doing that wrong," Rurik said. Arms crossed. "I know. You've known for a week. You keep doing it anyway." Tomas lowered the sword, breathing hard. "Figured eventually my arms would remember even if my head didn't." Rurik studied him for a long moment, then, unexpectedly, stepped into the yard and adjusted his grip with two blunt fingers. "Elbow down. You're telegraphing the swing before you've even started it." He stepped back. Again. They worked in silence for the better part of an hour, Rurik correcting, Tomas failing slightly less badly each time. Only when the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge did the captain finally speak again. "I didn't do this for you," he said. "I did it for her. She fights better when she isn't half watching the door for someone who might get himself killed standing in it." He nodded once, curt, and turned to leave. "You're still terrible. But you're less likely to die today than you were yesterday. That'll have to do." It wasn't warm, not yet. But Thomas understood, watching him go, that it was the closest thing to it Rurik knew how to offer, and in a hold where trust had become the rarest currency of all. He'd take it. She decided to bait it herself, feed 3 different circles of the court, 3 different travel plans, she told her captain. "Whichever version draws hired blades, that tells us who's talking." The first trap caught nothing. The second caught nothing either. Then 3 weeks in, a steward reported that the map room's travel ledger, the one recording exactly who had requested which route, and when, had gone missing from its locked case, and the only names on record as having borrowed a key that month belonged to 2 junior clerks. And Rurik, Thomas heard the accusation before Vashka did, whispering between 2 elders who hadn't noticed him passing. His stomach turned over. The man who'd killed a guardsman with his bare hands to save Vashka's life, who'd spent an hour at dawn correcting his sword grip for no reason but decency. That man's name. Sitting on a list beside 2 clerks, nobody in the hold had ever bothered to suspect of anything. He didn't say it to Vashka. Not yet. He told himself it was because the evidence was thin. A missing ledger and a key log, nothing more, but some smaller, uglier part of him wondered for one long night, Whether he'd simply been wrong about a man he badly wanted to be right about, Vashka confronted Rurik directly. The way she confronted everything, no accusation dressed up as a question. The ledger. Your key was logged? My key was logged because I checked the room myself the week after the ambush, looking for exactly the leak you're hunting now. Rurik didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice. If I were the traitor chieftain, I had a blade in my hand, and your back turned in that yard. I didn't use it on you. I used it on the man who tried to. It was true, and both of them knew it, and it still didn't fully explain the ledger. Vashka let him go without an accusation formally made, but the doubt didn't dissolve. It simply went quiet, the way real suspicion does, waiting for something sharper to either confirm it or clear it for good. Thomas kept his own quiet watch after that, noting which servants lingered too long near the map room, which stable hands asked questions that carried more weight than idle curiosity should. It broke open deep in that same winter. A servant loyal to Vashka's dead mother came forward, fearful but resolved, and named a steward, Orin, quiet, unremarkable. 3 chieftains served without ever once drawing notice, and Kesh's man for years, planted long before Vashka ever took the throne. It was Orin, they learned within the hour, who had taken the ledger. A steward's key opened every lock in that wing, Rurik's included. And he'd simply logged the borrowed key under the captain's name in the record to muddy the trail if anyone ever came looking. Rurik had spent 3 weeks half-suspected for a theft he'd never committed. And when the truth of it reached him, he said nothing at all, only nodded once. The way a man nods at whether he's already stopped being surprised by. When guards came for him, Orin ran for the high passes rather than face judgment. Snow was already filling his tracks by the time Vashka's warriors reached the tree line. Orc scouts who'd hunted these mountains their whole lives, and still they lost the trail within the hour. It was Thomas who found it again, a broken branch at knee height, a footprint half collapsed under fresh powder. The kind of details a human who'd spent a lifetime reading Hollow Pines forests knew to look for even where he'd never walked before. They cornered Orin in a shepherd's abandoned hut above the snow line, half frozen, out of the road and out of time. He'd barred the door with a fallen beam, and for a long moment there was nothing but wind and the sound of him breathing hard on the other side of splintered wood. "You don't have to make this worse than it already is," Vashka called through the door, her voice carrying none of the fury Thomas had half expected, only tired resolve. "You served 3 chieftains. Orin, you could have told me anything at any point in 20 years, and I would have listened. You'd have listened," Orin's voice came back, thin and cracked. "And then you'd have looked at me the way you look at everyone who isn't clan-born, like something borrowed. Kesh looked at me like I mattered. Kesh looked at you like a tool," Thomas said quietly, close enough to the door that his breath fogged in the cold. "Tools get used until they break, and then they get left behind. You're in a frozen hut at the edge of the world, alone, while the man who promised you land is nowhere to be found. That's not a man who valued you. That's a man who spent you—" Silence, long enough that Thomas thought they'd have to break the door down after all. Then the beam scraped free. He didn't wait for the blade at his throat before he broke. He sank down against the doorframe. All the fight went out of him at once, and the words came out in a rush, like something he'd been carrying too long to hold any further. "Kesh promised me land," he said, teeth chattering, title once the coup succeeded. "A reward for a lifetime. No one ever noticed." He gave up the location of Kesh's hidden camp 3 days north, and named 2 lesser conspirators still inside the hold who'd never once drawn suspicion. Both were quietly removed in the weeks that followed. The unease that had gripped Vashka's shoulders since the poisoning finally began, slowly, to ease. Word came within the month that Kesh himself had died somewhere in the northern wastes. Exposure, betrayal by his own remaining allies, or some justice neither of them would ever fully know. Vashka received the news in silence, and grieved privately for the uncle figure she'd lost long before his death. The man who'd taught her to hold a blade, and then turned its shadow against her. She did not yet know there was more to that death than either exposure or justice, or that the truth of it was already sealed in a letter Yura had carried, unopened, for weeks. The winter gathering was the one night the hold let its guard down. Fires burned in every hearth, long tables groaned under roasted game and mountain bread, and even the elders, who still eyed Thomas sideways, allowed themselves to laugh at the old songs, sung too loud and too off-key by warriors deep in their cups. Vashka had traded her mail for a simple dark green dress that evening. The first Thomas had ever seen her in anything but armor, and when she caught him staring, she only raised an eyebrow and asked if a chieftain wasn't permitted one soft evening a year. "You're allowed more than one," he said. "You've just never taken it. I'm taking it now." She pulled him toward the fire circle, where warriors twice his size were badly attempting a dance, meant for people considerably more sober. And for a while there was nothing in the world but firelight and her laughter, and the particular warmth of a hall that had, slowly, over a whole hard year, started to feel less like a court and more like a home. It was near midnight, the songs winding down when the strangers came, 2 of them, moving like they'd rehearsed every step of it, who understood exactly where to strike. The first went for Thomas. He came from the shadows behind the feast hall, blade already drawn, and Thomas turned a half-second too late to fully block it, but not too late to move. The old silent vow from the riverbank held, 6 years late and fully honored, he didn't freeze. He caught the man's wrist, took the blade's edge across his forearm instead of his throat, and held on. It was a shallow cut, nothing that should have mattered, the kind of wound he'd have shrugged off and mended with yarrow before supper. Any other night, Vashka was already moving toward him, blade drawn, her back turned for one unguarded heartbeat to the second man closing on her from the crowd's edge. Rurik saw it a half-second before anyone else in that hall did. He'd spent the whole evening standing just far enough from the fire to watch the doors instead of dancing, the way he always did, the way no one ever thanked him for. He didn't shout a warning. There wasn't time. He simply put himself where the blade was going. It took him in the side, deep, meant for Vashka's spine. He went down hard, and Vashka spun, and finished the second attacker in the same motion Tomas finished the first. Quick, brutal, over almost before the hall had risen from its benches. But by the time she reached Rurik, kneeling in the snow with both hands pressed white-knuckled over the wound, she already knew, the way any warrior knows, that this was not one that mended. "You weren't supposed to be close enough to matter," she said, furious with him, with herself, with the whole night. "Told you once," Rurik managed, blood at his teeth, the ghost of something almost like a smile. Didn't do any of it for him. His eyes found Thomas over her shoulder, just for a moment. Did it for her. Always was always going to be for her. He didn't last long after that. Long enough for Vashka to hold him, long enough for the hall to go utterly silent around them. Warriors who'd spent a whole hard year deciding whether to trust a woodcutter, now watching their captain die, protecting the chieftain he'd served since she was a girl, too small to lift a blade. Not long enough for anything else to be said that mattered more than what he'd already said. Vashka did not weep in front of her court. She knelt in the snow a moment longer than dignity strictly allowed, and then she rose. And her voice, when she finally spoke again, was steadier than anyone in that hall had any right to expect. She turned to find Thomas, needing simply to see him standing, and found him swaying instead. It hit him slowly enough that no one had noticed until it was already well along. A cold that had nothing to do with the winter air, spreading up from the shallow cut on his forearm into something that made his own hand look distant and unfamiliar when he tried to lift it. His knees went first. Vashka caught him before his head could, and the fear that crossed her face then was a different animal, entirely from anything the fight itself had drawn out of her. Yura reached them at a run, and one look at the grey creeping into his lips told her everything the wound itself hadn't. "Black-tongue root," she said, prying his sleeve back with hands that had gone suddenly, professionally steady, even as her voice hadn't. Ground fine and worked into the steel, slow, meant to look like nothing until it's too late to matter. She looked up at Vashka. "I have something that might counter it. I don't know if I have enough of it, or if there's still time for it to work at all. I won't lie to you and say I'm certain. That was the longest night either of them would ever fully describe afterward. because so much of it happened in the space between one breath and the next, being uncertain whether there would be another after it. Vashka did not leave his side. She held his hand through the worst of the fever. Through the hour, his breathing went so shallow that Yura pressed her ear to his chest twice just to be sure. Through the grey hours before dawn, when even Yura's steady hands had started, finally, to shake. It was somewhere in that long, uncertain dark, with Rurik's body not yet cold in the next room, and Thomas's pulse thready enough that no one dared say aloud what they were afraid of, that Yura drew a small, sealed letter from inside her robe and pressed it into Vashka's hands. "He gave me this before he vanished for the last time," she said, "weeks before the gathering. He told me to burn it if he came back, and to give it to you if he didn't. I didn't know until tonight, watching that amulet get passed from hand to hand, what he meant by any of it." Vashka broke the seal with hands that hadn't stopped shaking since Rurik died, and read it by firelight while Thomas's breath rattled thin beside her. "I went to the northern delegation myself," Kesh had written the week after our talk on the ridge. "I told them what I know of Karim's Hollow, not all of it, only enough to matter to people already looking for a reason to break the treaty rather than honor it. I offered to let that truth surface on my own terms, slowly, in exchange for time. I did not do this because I am a good man discovering virtue at the end of a wasted life. I did it because I have spent every year since Karim's Hollow believing the only mercy left to me was arithmetic. That if I could not save the 60, I could at least be useful in saving whoever came after them, one at a time, for as long as I had left to spend. I bought you months, Vashka, with a truth that was never mine alone to sell, and I am not proud of the price, only of what it purchased. It will not balance the scale. Nothing ever will. But it is the only currency I had left, and I have now spent all of it. I do not know if the boy's mother ever told him where she came from. If she didn't, that was her mercy, and I would not undo it even now. But if the truth ever does surface, and truths like this one rarely stay buried as long as we need them to, tell him this, from the man who has no right to ask anything of him, that the night I couldn't stop, I at least made certain there was a night after it. That has to be worth something, even from me. Even now, there was no signature. There didn't need to be. Vashka read it twice, then a third time, then set it aside and did not speak of it again that night, not because it didn't matter, but because there was only room in her chest for one fear at a time, and the one beside her, breathing too shallow in the firelight, had already claimed all of it. Thomas's fever broke an hour before dawn. It broke the way storms do in these mountains, all at once, without warning, leaving behind an exhausted, disbelieving quiet. Yura sat back on her heels and let out a breath she'd clearly been holding for hours. Vashka did not move from his side until the sun was fully up, and even then only to press her forehead once, briefly, to his, as if to confirm with her own skin what her eyes were already telling her. It was one of her own guards, going through what the dead attacker carried in the grey hour before all that, who'd found the mark, not Kesh's sigil, no token of the Eastern conspiracy at all. A small carved amulet, northern craftsmanship, the kind worn only by clans who'd sat at that same treaty table the night of the poisoning. With Kesh's letter in hand now, the amulet no longer needed much explaining. It only confirmed what he'd already paid to delay. They weren't finishing Kesh's work, Vashka said to Thomas, once he could sit up and hold a cup without his hand shaking too badly to manage it. They were finishing what his chaos started, on their own timeline instead of his. A treaty that holds is bad for clans who profit from the border staying unsettled. He bought us months by handing them a truth that was never his to give away. She set the letter in his hands and watched his face as he read it. This was never only about me. It never was. And Rurik paid for a war he never chose a side in, bought time by a man who spent his whole life deciding, alone, who was worth spending it on. Thomas read the letter twice. He didn't cry, though something in his jaw worked hard against it. "He knew about my mother," he said finally. "He knew, and he let a stranger tell me instead of ever saying it himself. Would you have wanted it from him?" He thought about that honestly, the way he thought about everything. "No," he admitted. I don't think I could have forgiven it from his own mouth. Maybe he knew that too. He set the letter down, careful, the way a man sets down something he isn't finished being angry at. Doesn't make it easier. Doesn't make him good, but I don't think I hate him anymore either. I don't know what's left in the space where that used to sit. Neither of them had an answer for that. Some men, it turned out, didn't leave behind a clean shape once they were gone, only an uneven one. Equal parts wound and atonement that the people they left living had to learn to carry without ever quite being able to set it down. It changed nothing that night that could be undone. The attackers were dead. The hall was safe, but the cost of it sat heavy and permanent where a good man had bled out in the snow, protecting a woman he'd once claimed, gruffly, to have no particular warmth for, and where another man had come within a single fevered hour of not seeing morning. It changed everything after because it meant the danger hadn't ended with Kesh's letter or Orin's confession. Somewhere beyond her borders, a treaty she'd already paid for 3 times over was being patiently undermined by people who'd never once needed to set foot inside her hold to do it. A war fought with years and patience instead of blades. The kind she'd spend the rest of her rule learning to win. They looked at the two of them. Once Thomas could finally stand again, bloodied, hollowed out, both of them grieving in ways that had nothing tidy about them, and saw something that hadn't been there before. Not a weak human sheltered by his powerful mate. 2 people who had learned, at the highest cost either of them had yet paid, to carry loss the same way they'd learned to fight, together. And without pretending it cost them nothing, the whispers in the hold began, at last, to change. Not to full acceptance, not yet, not so quickly, but to something that could, given enough seasons, grow into it. Rurik would not be there to see it. Neither of them ever stopped noticing that. And somewhere in the northern wastes, in a grave no one would ever mark, neither would Kesh, a man who had spent his entire life doing terrible arithmetic with other people's lives, and had finally, at the very end, done it once with his own. Before the spring settled fully into the mountains, they made the journey down to Hollow Pine together, the first time Vashka had ever walked openly into a human village, and the first time Thomas had been back since the night he left with a stranger's guard waiting at the tree line. The village didn't know what to do with either of them at first. Doors that had always opened for Thomas stayed half shut, a beat too long. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts at the orc woman in the green cloak, and old men who'd once muttered cowardly under their breath now had nothing to say at all. They visited his sister's grave on the hill above the village, the stone marker weathered but still standing where he'd set it 6 years before. Vashka stood back at a respectful distance while he knelt and cleared the winter's leaves from the base of it, saying nothing for a long while. "I used to come here and tell her I was sorry," he said finally. "Every visit. Sorry I hesitated. Sorry I wasn't fast enough." He brushed the last of the frost from the letters of her name. "This is the first time I've come, and had something else to tell her instead." Vashka knelt beside him in the wet grass, careless again of her fine cloak. "What will you tell her now?" "That I finally didn't hesitate when it mattered." He looked at her. "That it worked out better than I ever let myself hope it would, on their way back through the village centre. The old woman from the onion stall, the same one whose narrowed eyes had nearly given them away, months before, stopped them both in the square." She looked Vashka up and down, slow and unhurried, the way she might size up a horse before a purchase. "You're the tall cousin," she said. "I am not his cousin," Vashka said evenly. The old woman snorted, something almost like a laugh. "No," she agreed. "Suppose you're not." She pressed a small bundle of onions into Thomas's hands without further comment and went back to her stall. And that, in the end, was as close to acceptance as Hollow Pine ever quite managed to offer, grudging, practical, and entirely genuine in its own quiet way. Spring returned the way it always did, slow, stubborn, green pushing through retreating snow, one careful step at a time. Thomas knelt in the garden he'd insisted on planting outside the hold's stone walls. Thyme and herbs carried up from Hollow Pine, growing now beside mountain plants, whose names he was only just learning to say correctly. He wasn't a poor man here, though he still wore simple clothes, and still trusted his own 2 hands over any servants. He'd earned something better than wealth. People who listened when he spoke. Not for his title, but because season after season he'd proven his counsel was worth having. A single stone stood at the garden's far edge, plain and unmarked by any title, where Rurik's ashes had been laid at his own captain's request. No grand tomb, only a soldier's plot facing the practice yard he'd spent 30 years pacing. Tomas still trained there most mornings, and still corrected his own grip the exact way Rurik once had. Elbow down, and still said it out loud to no one in particular. The way some habits refuse to let the dead go quietly. Vashka found Thomas in the garden most evenings now, and the woman who'd once flinched at gentle touch leaned into it without thinking. She was a stronger chieftain than before that terrible year, her rule more deeply rooted for having weathered the challenge to it. She still carried scars, seen and unseen, but wore them now the way she'd once told him warriors wore their honors, without shame. She knelt beside him in the dark soil, careless of the mud on her fine cloak, something the old Vashka never would have allowed. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The ravine, the storm, the night I nearly died in front of you?" He thought about it, not the fear of it. "I think of the moment I knelt beside a stranger bleeding in the mud and decided, without understanding why, that she was worth saving." He looked at her. "Still the finest thing I've ever done, choosing to stop that morning instead of walking on by." Neither of them spoke of Karim's hollow that evening, though it sat between them the way it always did now, quietly, unresolved and maybe unresolvable, a truth too dangerous to hand to the wider world and too heavy for either of them to carry entirely alone. They had settled, without ever formally deciding it, on carrying it together instead, not buried, not confessed, simply held, the way two people learn to hold anything too large for one set of hands. She took his hand, calloused fingers laced through hers, and rested her head against his shoulder, the way she had that very first winter beside his small fire, back when neither of them had dared name what was. Growing between them, the sun went down behind the far mountains in long ribbons of gold, light spilling warm across two worlds that were never meant to touch, and had found a way to hold each other close anyway. She had spent her life valued only for her strength, and finally found someone who valued the whole of her heart. He had spent 6 years believing he no longer deserved to matter to anyone, and found a home in the last place he ever thought to look. 2 worlds. On love, and against every reason it should never have been possible, it was in the end more than enough. If you were Thomas, would you have left everything behind to follow Vashka into the mountains? Tell me honestly in the comments.